everyone. I'm really delighted to be here. It's the end of the day. My presentation will be a little bit different just in my own perspective. I'm with the Sustainability Academy, heading up business engagement activities there. So I'm working with businesses to assess their training needs and designing training courses for business. But prior to this role, I was in the Aldi South group, working at their international sustainability office as a climate specialist, and then going on to their global sourcing department, working on the development of more sustainable procurement processes. Before this, I was a research assistant in the School of Law. Here in UCC, I was assistant to Dr. Anya Royal, and this was my first role in sustainability after I completed my Master's in Environmental Law here in UCC as well. So I'm delighted to be here. Due to my experience in the private sector, my presentation is my own observations on the ongoing commentary on the EU Omnibus package as a business practitioner and not a doctrinal legal expert. So it's a little bit different in that sense. So looking to today's theme of consolidation in environmental law, the EU Omnibus package is a timely example of an attempt to bring more clarity and consistency to the growing number of EU regulatory frameworks. The EU Omnibus package sought to reduce complexity of multiple corporate sustainability legislations put forward by the EU, including the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD, EU Taxonomy and Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. In February of this year, the EU published the amendments to the CSRD and the CSDDD, which I'll focus on, and this entered into force in March. Businesses operating in the EU will now see significant changes to their obligations for compliance under these legislations. While the overarching aim was to reduce complexity and regulatory burden of these legislations, the question is now being asked, has the package rolled back too much and created a weakened attempt of regulating big business? When addressing this question, as I said, my commentary will be based on my experience working in and with businesses as I examine aspects of the Omnibus and their effect on the functionality of sustainable business practices. My focus will largely be on the practical implications of implementing the legislations in question. So the topic of regulating big business at the EU level tends to evoke a polarised response, either presenting a pessimistic outlook on unchecked capitalism, or the EU is hailed for not overstepping their legislative powers. To take a more balanced approach, I will today present some positives as well as negatives. I would like to highlight what the EU Omnibus got right when considering the practicalities of businesses implementing sustainability reporting, while also highlighting elements of the package that represent a weakening of ambition when it comes to ensuring businesses transition to more sustainable practices. So, first looking to the positives, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or the CSDDD. This directive aims to foster sustainable and responsible corporate behaviour in companies' operations and across their value chains. Under this directive, companies within scope must identify and address adverse risks in their value chains to human rights and environmental impacts. Under the changes to this directive from the EU Omnibus package, the scoping exercise has now been strengthened and clarified. Companies in scope of the directive are obliged to conduct a scoping exercise to identify areas across their operations, subsidiaries, and relevant business partners where adverse impacts are most likely to occur. Under the adjustment, the directive now more clearly expects companies to prioritise impacts based on severity first, not just likelihood. This means even low probability but high impact risks must be prioritised. Companies will no longer be able to feign ignorance to the impacts of their business upon their value chains and will be expected to focus where risk is most material. The framework has become more operationally realistic by narrowing where companies must look in detail. While many companies have been carrying out risk assessments across their value chains, this legal obligation has the potential to make it a standardised practice that brings all in-scope businesses to the same standard for risk assessment. It also has potential to standardise the way in which business partners are asked for relevant information on risks throughout their own supply chains. Again, while this has been in practice prior to the directive, this legal obligation can bring about simplified processes for business partners who need to report to their corporate customers. In practice, business partners struggle to report to their corporate customers who may demand different standards of data points, causing a disproportionate burden on smaller businesses. From the point of view of practical implementation, this directive has seen some needed improvements. And moving on to the standardisation and simplified templates, a key aspect of the omnibus, which is often neglected, in my view, in the commentary, is the introduction of standardised templates for reporting. The standardisation efforts will continue to reduce the complexity in which companies are reporting for the CSRD and EU taxonomy. Companies of all sizes can struggle with effective data management despite developments in the IT space. Most companies still rely heavily on their own internal data collection, though through disjointed tools, leading to wide and varied standards for reporting. The EU has supported the provision of a central portal that provides up-to-date templates for data collection, reducing the compliance burden significantly. While not fully set up and functioning yet, the adoption of this part of the deal signals that the EU are aware of the realities of implementation for businesses. This signals that the EU has considered the realities of implementing their initial version of the CSRD legislation for businesses. Those who have not worked directly in companies trying to implement the CSRD and EU taxonomy have not experienced the realities of interpreting and implementing the previous versions of the legislations without effective guidance published by the European Commission. Effectively, it was very messy. Now to the missed opportunities, so the negatives. First, the removal of the obligation for companies to adopt a transition plan for climate change mitigation. The obligation has been removed from Article 22 of the original CSDDD. The EU has committed to being net zero by 2050, yet they have removed the obligation for businesses to create and publish their climate transition plans. Like other changes to the omnibus, this does not mean that all businesses operating in the EU will stop their climate transition work. Yet, this can be seen as a huge missed opportunity to standardise the process of publishing a climate transition plan. This obligation had the potential to create a legal standard for such plans and oblige those who are lagging in their transition to come up to full speed. Many commentators have seen this removal as a loss for company transparency. While heavy reporting obligations may have stifled business strategies, a mandatory standard for climate transition plans may have forced companies to set realistic and meaningful reduction targets and stick to them. The removal of a legal standard for climate transition plans may also increase the risk of greenwashing, allowing companies to oversimplify their transition plans and misleading consumers by leaving out key information. Second, the minimising of stakeholder engagement requirements. So the CSDDD has now had a narrowing and restructuring of stakeholder engagement obligations. These requirements have been minimised and streamlined with the removal of the obligation to terminate business as a last resort. Many companies who are attempting to reduce their Scope 3 emissions must rely on the partnership between the business and their suppliers. Yet in practice, there is no definitive framework on how best to engage with your suppliers to reduce your value chain emissions. Many companies are struggling to gather accurate data for reporting and are a long way off receiving primary data for reporting and being able to report meaningful reductions from their own supply base. Implementing a legal framework which standardizes the way businesses collect data and engage with their supply base is a huge missed opportunity for meaningful impact reductions, as well as for increasing the standard for reporting emissions. Many companies know that they need to do supplier engagement, but many are left flailing when it comes to how to do it. So, while the bureaucratic and legislative burden has certainly been lessened by changes adopted by the EU Omnibus package, key tools that help business operate more sustainably have also been removed, such as the aforementioned transition plans and supplier engagement. Furthermore, the size of a company does not always correlate with risks they pose to environmental and social impacts. As such, leaving out SMEs may leave SMEs out of scope for these legislations may lead to a regulatory blind spot. Many companies are reliant on their suppliers' ability to achieve meaningful reductions within their Scope 3 emissions inventory. Yet stakeholder engagement is done in a very ad hoc manner across numerous industries. By creating legal obligations and frameworks to carry out meaningful stakeholder engagement, there could have been more room for more collaborative, sustainable business practices. After this round of negotiations for the Omnibus package, businesses are still left with fewer legal frameworks for creating transparency within their supply base. Yet I do believe it's not all doom and gloom. Key resources have been freed up in sustainability teams by lessening the time-intensive activities of reporting. Reporting has a value in sustainability, as one cannot reduce what one has not measured. And this is a key sustainability principle when you're working in business. Have to measure in order to say that you reduced your impact. But it should not and cannot take the brunt of the resources for sustainability within businesses. Many businesses reported that the obligation to report on certain data points under the CSRD did not transform the quality of data to the extent that they expected. When compliance becomes the key driver of resources and sustainability in business, little resources are left to go beyond compliance and be truly transformative in your business. Similarly, under the CSDDD, we have seen a clear operationalization of risk-based due diligence, which has also lessened the burden of businesses to go deep on all potential risks in their supply chain and instead focusing on the most severe impacts. For business, this is a shift to more manageable, staged due diligence processes which better reflect the realities of business operations. So to quickly summarise, the EU Omnibus package has created a lot of fear and scepticism around the EU's ambition to better regulate business in light of a more sustainable future. In ways, these criticisms have validity, as some attempts of streamlining and simplifying could better be described as relaxing and rolling back of needed regulations and leaving many companies out of scope of their remaining obligations for compliance. Yet one could argue that the appetite for sustainability in business has not disappeared from Europe and that resources for sustainability have freed up in practice. In practice, the previous iteration of the legislations created complex systems and arguably added little value to the innovation and transformation needed for sustainability in business. What is now needed from EU leadership is sustained ambition in the green transition and the implementation of proven policy levers that can support sustainable growth rather than slowing down innovation with bureaucratic burdens. So I just want to say that I worked in Aldi for about 3.5 years as CSRD was coming into place, and the amount of time, effort and resources that was put into place to try and become compliant, but for just these highly well-educated people to not fully understand what the EU put in place, and the EU probably did not understand what it put in place in practice. So I just have a bit of a different perspective on things when it comes to the legislations, just from my practical experience in business, and that's me.